Dear learners, welcome back to WSE True Stories, where English learning becomes an unforgettable adventure. Today, you are about to witness one of the most extraordinary journeys ever lived, the rise of a teenage girl from a quiet village who, guided by faith and courage, changed the fate of a kingdom. Her name was Joan of Arc, or in French, Jeanne d'Arc. She wasn't born into nobility. She didn't come from a military family. She never attended school. And yet, by the age of 17, she stood at the head of an army, leading grown men into battle, facing impossible odds. How could a young girl in the Middle Ages, a time when women had little voice and peasants were powerless, become a national hero, a saint, and a symbol of resistance? This is not just a story about war. It's a story of belief when no one believes you. It's a story of courage in the face of doubt. And it's a story of sacrifice for something far greater than yourself. As you listen, you'll improve your English, your vocabulary, your comprehension, but more than that, you'll carry with you a lesson in resilience, in purpose, and in heart. Get ready for one of the most powerful and inspirational stories in history. Let's begin the journey of Joan of Arc. But to understand her fire, we must begin in a time of darkness. The year was 1412. In a small rural village called Domremy, nestled in the eastern part of France, a baby girl was born to Jacques d'Arc and Isabelle Romee. Her name was Jeanne, but the world would remember her as Joan of Arc. She was born into a world of chaos, a world torn apart by the 100 Years' War, a brutal and seemingly endless conflict between France and England. For generations, kings, nobles, and armies had battled over land, power, and the rightful crown. Towns were destroyed, families displaced, and fear had taken root in the hearts of ordinary people. Domremy itself was a small, quiet farming village, but even there, war cast its long shadow. English soldiers raided nearby regions. The local people lived in poverty, uncertain of tomorrow. Young Jeanne grew up hearing stories of defeat, seeing soldiers march through fields, and watching her country suffer. Her family, though poor, was deeply religious and hardworking. Jacques was a farmer, and Isabelle taught her daughter the prayers of the church. Jeanne never learned to read or write, but she developed something far more powerful, a deep, unwavering faith. Even as a child, Jeanne stood out. She was gentle, kind, and serious beyond her years. She spent long hours in church, praying, weeping, whispering to God. While other children played, she listened, not just to the priests, but to something inside her. And above it all, she lived in a land without a true king. France, divided and weak, had lost control of Paris. The so-called king, Charles VII, had not yet been crowned. The sacred city of Reims, where kings were traditionally anointed, was in enemy hands. Many believed the French crown was broken forever. But in the heart of a simple farm girl, among fields of wheat and whispers of prayer, a spark was waiting to ignite. She didn't know it yet, but her life would soon collide with destiny. The world called for a savior. And she believed, with all her soul, that God had chosen her. But before she could lead an army, she would first have to face disbelief, and voices no one else could hear. At the age of 13, Jeanne's quiet life changed forever. It began not with a thunderclap, but in stillness, as she stood alone in her father's garden, sunlight drifting through the trees. That's when she heard the voices. She would later say they were not frightening. In fact, they were beautiful, powerful, full of light. At first, they simply told her to be good, to pray, to stay close to God. But over time, their message became more urgent, and more unbelievable. The voices revealed themselves: Saint Michael, the archangel warrior of heaven; Saint Catherine and Saint Margaret, holy martyrs of the Church. They told Jean she had a divine mission. You must save France. Imagine being a teenage girl in a poor village, unable to read, barely known outside your town, and being told by heavenly messengers that you were chosen to lead a kingdom back to life. She was stunned, confused, afraid. But not for long. Jean believed the voices with all her heart. Her soul burned with purpose. Yet, who would ever believe her? She told no one, not at first. Not her father, who was stern and skeptical. Not the villagers, who feared anything strange as heresy or madness. To claim visions was dangerous in medieval France. The Church was powerful. So were accusations. Many had been burned alive for less. Meanwhile, the war around her grew worse. The English and their allies, the Burgundians, advanced across France. Orleans, a vital city on the Loire River, was under siege. If it fell, many believed the kingdom would fall with it. And Charles, the uncrowned heir, the Dauphin of France, seemed helpless. His army was weak, his court divided, his future uncertain. He had not yet claimed the crown at Reims. His people were losing faith. But Jean's faith only grew stronger. By the time she was 16, the voices were no longer gentle. They demanded action. They told her, "Go to the Dauphin. Tell him you will lead his army. And he will make you commander." The command was absurd. Impossible. A peasant girl, not a knight, not a noble, demanding an audience with the future king? Talking of visions? Of war? And yet, Jean set her heart to do it. She tried to go quietly to a nearby town, where a relative served as a guard. He refused to help. She was sent home. But she didn't give up. Eventually, she found a nobleman, Robert de Baudricourt, captain of the garrison at Vaucouleurs. He laughed when he heard her request. A girl? Lead the army of France. But Jean was relentless. She spoke with such confidence, fire, and strange calm that even hardened soldiers began to listen. And one day, she made a bold prediction. Before Mid-Lent, the English will be driven from Orleans, and the Dauphin will be crowned at Reims. That is what God commands. It sounded like madness. But in war, madness and miracles sometimes walk hand in hand. And Baudricourt, against all reason, finally agreed to send her to the royal court. The journey would be long, dangerous, and full of eyes watching her every move. But Jean had begun her mission. And there would be no turning back. In early 1429, Jean of Domremy, now just 17 years old, began her journey to meet the Dauphin. She rode through enemy territory, escorted by a small group of soldiers loyal to Baudricourt. They dressed her in men's clothing to protect her from danger and scandal, and cut her hair short, a bold and shocking appearance for a girl of her time. The trip to Chinon, where Charles was staying, was over 300 miles long. It was winter. The roads were treacherous. The English and Burgundians held many nearby lands. But Jean remained calm and fearless, praying constantly, never doubting her mission. Her courage impressed the soldiers. They began to respect her, even protect her like one of their own. When they finally arrived at court, Jean did not meet applause. She met suspicion, mockery, and disbelief. Charles's advisers thought she was a fraud, or worse, possessed. The church warned him to stay away. After all, she was an illiterate peasant girl claiming to speak to saints, something that could lead to serious consequences with both religious and political authorities. But Charles was curious. Desperate for hope, he allowed Jean to enter his court, though he hid himself among his courtiers, thinking to expose her as a liar. Jean had never seen him before, had no portrait, no description. And yet, she walked straight through the hall, past lords and nobles, and fell to her knees before the man in disguise. "Gentle Dauphin," she said, "God has sent me to save you and your kingdom." That moment stunned the court. Charles, moved but cautious, still didn't fully trust her. So he arranged for her to be examined by church scholars and theologians at Poitiers. For 3 weeks, they questioned her, tested her knowledge of Scripture, searched for signs of heresy. She answered with simplicity, humility, and confidence. She told them she wore men's clothes by command of God, and for protection. She said she would rather die than give up her mission. The scholars could find no evil in her. Some even began to believe she was sent by divine will. Charles finally gave her permission. She would be sent to Orleans, the besieged city, where French forces had nearly lost hope. But Jean made a condition. "Give me soldiers, and give me armor. I go not as a symbol, but as a commander." So they gave her a white horse, a custom-made suit of silver armor, a banner bearing the names of Jesus and Mary, surrounded by lilies. She refused to carry a sword at first, but legend says she found a blade buried behind the altar of a chapel, exactly where the voices told her it would be. And with this, the strangest and most daring chapter of the war began. A teenage girl, untrained in combat, unlettered in strategy, riding at the head of an army to lift a siege no one believed could be won. Men followed her not out of duty, but because she gave them something they hadn't felt in years: hope. But Orleans would not fall easily. Jean would soon face real battle, real blood, and real fear. And in the smoke of war, her faith would be tested like never before. When Jean and her army arrived at Orleans in late April 1429, the city was on the brink of collapse. The English had laid siege to it for over 6 months. Supplies were dwindling. Morale was low. The people, and even the French commanders, had begun to accept defeat as inevitable. But when Jean rode in, dressed in shining armor, her banner held high, everything changed. People lined the streets to see her. Some wept. Others knelt as if witnessing a miracle. Many had heard the rumors, a maid sent by God. And when they saw her face, so young, so fierce, so full of light, they began to believe. But belief alone couldn't win battles. Jean still had to convince the hardened generals, men twice her age, veterans of many wars, to let her lead. At first, they resisted. They ignored her advice, laughed at her passion, and continued their slow, cautious plans. But Jean was not here to wait. She believed that God had given her a mission to act swiftly and boldly, and her voice rang through the camp. "The longer we wait, the more our people suffer. The Lord does not reward hesitation." Finally, they relented. With Jean riding at the front, the French launched a daring assault on one of the English forts, called St. Loup. Her presence transformed the troops. Soldiers who had once feared the English now surged forward, shouting her name, lifting their swords high. And they won. Fort St. Loup fell. Then another. And another. As the battles continued, Jean was everywhere. Riding through volleys of arrows. Praying aloud. rallying the men when they began to falter. She carried no weapon, only her banner, saying, "It is not mine to kill, but to inspire." But war does not spare even the brave. On May 7th, during the assault on Les Tourelles, the most heavily defended English stronghold, Jean climbed a ladder to the top of the walls, urging her men forward. Suddenly, an arrow pierced her shoulder, knocking her to the ground. The French panicked. Without her, they feared all was lost. But Jean rose. Wounded, bleeding, she climbed back on her horse and shouted, "Do not retreat. The fort is ours. Go forward, and do not fear." Her voice rang across the battlefield like thunder. That moment, of pain, courage, and will, shattered the English line. By nightfall, Les Tourelles had fallen. The siege of Orleans was broken. It was one of the most stunning turnarounds in the history of the war. And it made Jean a legend. But it was more than just a military victory. For the first time in years, France had hope. A spark had been lit. People began to speak not just of Jean, but of divine destiny, of justice, of renewal. And now, Jean turned her eyes to the greatest goal of all, the coronation of Charles VII. According to tradition, a French king was not truly king until crowned at the cathedral in Reims, but that city was deep in enemy territory. The path was full of risk. Many believed the journey was suicide. But Jean believed it was necessary. "God wills it," she told Charles. "Your people must see you as their rightful king. And I will lead you there." Charles hesitated. His court was divided. But public opinion, fired by Jean's victories, now demanded action. And so, a royal procession began. Through town after town, Jean led the way, and the people opened their gates without resistance. On July 17, 1429, just 2 months after the lifting of the siege, Charles entered Reims and was anointed as King Charles VII. Jean stood beside him in her armor, holding her banner, weeping with joy. She had done the impossible. She had turned the tide of war. She had given a broken nation back its king. But deep in her heart, Jean knew her mission was not over. For where there is light, darkness often waits close behind. After the coronation at Reims, Jean had reached what many would call a perfect ending. She had fulfilled her divine mission, or so it seemed. But for Jean, it was not the end. It was the middle of the journey. France was not yet free. The English still occupied Paris, and large portions of the kingdom remained under enemy control. Jean pressed King Charles to march on and reclaim his capital. But now, the tide of politics began to turn against her. The same nobles and advisers who once doubted her now feared her power. A peasant girl who had led armies, dictated strategy, and stirred the hearts of a nation, she didn't fit their world. Some whispered that Jean had become too proud. Others feared her closeness to God more than they feared the English. Charles, too, began to change. The cautious, uncertain prince had become king, and like many kings, he now preferred peace, negotiation, and politics over war. Jean's pleas for continued military campaigns were politely ignored, her counsel less and less requested. The girl who had once stood at his side was being quietly pushed away. But Jean could not stop. In September 1429, she led an assault on Paris, without full royal support. The attack failed. Jean was wounded again. It was the beginning of a slow unraveling. Over the following months, Jean continued to fight in small skirmishes, still wearing her armor, still believing in her mission. But her troops were fewer. Supplies were limited. And the king had other priorities. Then, in the spring of 1430, tragedy struck. Jean rode to defend the town of Compiègne, which was under siege by Burgundian forces, allies of the English. During a retreat, as she covered her soldiers' escape, the city gates were closed behind her. She was trapped. Captured by the Burgundians, Jean hoped for ransom. In those days, noble prisoners were usually held for exchange. But Jean was no ordinary captive. The English wanted her, desperately. She had become a symbol of French resistance, a threat not only in battle, but in spirit. And so, for 10,000 livres, the Burgundians sold her to the English. The king she had crowned did nothing to rescue her. There was no negotiation, no gold offered, no troops sent. Jean was left alone, betrayed by politics, abandoned by the very man she had fought to make king. The English, eager to destroy her reputation and crush the morale she had inspired, chose not to execute her as a soldier. No, they would try her as a heretic. They placed her in the hands of the Inquisition, led by pro-English churchmen. And in Rouen, behind stone walls, Jean began her final and greatest trial. She was chained in a cold cell, under constant guard, forbidden even the comfort of a priest. For months, they interrogated her. Over 70 sessions, her enemies tried to twist her words, confuse her, trap her into condemning herself. Do you believe your voices came from God? Do you wear men's clothes to defy the church? Are you not guilty of pride, witchcraft, rebellion? Jean, who had never been taught to read or write, stood alone before learned men. Yet she answered with brilliant clarity, humility, and wit. If I am not in God's grace, may God bring me to it. If I am, may He keep me there. That one sentence, spoken under duress, is still considered one of the most perfect statements of faith in medieval theology. But the trial was not fair. It was never meant to be. The outcome had been written before it began. In May 1431, the judges declared her guilty of heresy, largely based on her continued wearing of men's clothing, something they claimed proved her defiance of the church. Jean was sentenced to death. She was just 19 years old. But even as the sentence fell, she stood without tears, without fear. Her journey was nearly at its end. But her story was far from over. And in her final moments, Jean would speak words that would echo for centuries. It was dawn on May 30th, 1431, in the marketplace of Rouen. A wooden scaffold stood tall, stacked with kindling, and in the center, a stake. Bound to it, wearing a simple white robe, stood Jeanne d'Arc. She had requested a cross. A kind English soldier gave her one, which she clutched tightly. Another friar held a crucifix high before her as the executioners prepared the flames. Jean's voice, still clear and strong, rang out over the crowd. Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. As the fire rose, she did not cry out in terror. Witnesses reported that she showed no fear. And as the flames consumed her, a silence fell over the square, the kind that lingers when something holy has passed. Even her enemies were shaken. One of the English soldiers watching the scene is said to have cried, "We are lost. We have burned a saint." But if the goal of the trial and execution had been to erase Jean's legacy, it failed spectacularly. Because her death became her ultimate triumph. The people of France, including many who had once doubted her, were now stirred by guilt, grief, and admiration. The young woman who had ridden to battle, inspired hope, and faced her death with unwavering faith, had become a martyr. And though Jean's body was reduced to ashes, her spirit spread like wildfire. In the years after her death, the war dragged on. But her memory refused to fade. Charles VII, the very king who had done nothing to save her, began to reclaim more of France. Town by town, city by city, the French, now united and emboldened, began to drive out the English. 22 years after Jean's death, the 100 Years' War ended, with France victorious. But perhaps the most powerful victory came not on the battlefield, but in the court of history and faith. In 1456, 25 years after her execution, Pope Calixtus III authorized a retrial. Witnesses from Jean's life, townspeople, soldiers, priests, came forward. They told the truth of her piety, her bravery, her purity of heart. The Church declared that Jean had been wrongfully condemned. Her name was cleared. The girl once called a heretic was now known as a woman of God. Centuries passed, and Jean continued to inspire. In 1920, almost 500 years after her death, Jeanne d'Arc was canonized as a saint by the Catholic Church. She became not just a symbol of France, but of faith, courage, and purpose. Today, statues of Jeanne stand across the world. Her image appears in books, plays, music, and film. Her name is taught in schools. Her story, a teenage girl with no wealth, no noble blood, no education, continues to move hearts and minds. Because she proved something eternal. That even one soul, guided by truth, can shape history. That even when abandoned, misunderstood, or condemned, a pure heart can endure all things. That courage is not the absence of fear, but the will to act through it. And that some flames, though they burn the body, can never destroy the light within. Jeanne d'Arc did not live to see the fruits of her mission, but her legacy lives on. And in every generation, someone, somewhere, remembers her and chooses to be brave. Jeanne d'Arc's life was short, just 19 years, but her legacy stretches across the centuries like a bridge of light between the past and the present. She was a peasant girl with no formal training, no family connections, and no worldly power. And yet, she rose to lead armies, crown a king, and change the course of a war that had raged for nearly 100 years. But what truly makes her extraordinary was not just what she achieved, it was how she achieved it. With faith, not fear. With conviction, not calculation. With purity of heart, not pursuit of power. Jeanne reminds us that greatness is not reserved for the elite. It's not about wealth, or education, or titles. It's about the courage to act when others stay silent. The willingness to believe in something bigger than oneself. And the strength to keep going, even when every voice around you says no. Throughout history, there have been generals, kings, and rulers whose names are remembered. But Jeanne is different. She is remembered not just as a leader, but as a symbol. A symbol of what one determined soul can do when touched by faith and guided by purpose. She also reminds us of the cost of courage. That speaking truth to power often leads to isolation, betrayal, and pain. But also, that the cost is worth it, because truth does not die. It might be burned, hidden, or silenced for a time, but it always rises again. Jeanne's story is not just France's story. It's a universal story, of faith in the unseen, of standing up against impossible odds, of staying true to one's mission even when the world turns away. In a world that often rewards conformity, Jeanne stands as a beacon for those who dare to be different. For those who hear a calling, and answer it. For those who are told they are too young, too small, too weak, and prove otherwise. Jeanne d'Arc died centuries ago. But today, her name lives on in the hearts of millions. And maybe, just maybe, in yours too. Because her fire was never meant to end on that stake in Rouen. It was meant to be carried forward, in every act of bravery, in every stand for justice, in every quiet voice that says, "I believe, and I will not be afraid." Dear learners, you've just traveled through the extraordinary life of Jeanne d'Arc, a teenage girl who didn't just believe in miracles, she became one. She faced the impossible, stood against kingdoms, and died with the name of Christ on her lips, not because she sought fame, but because she chose faith over fear. And now, centuries later, her voice still speaks to each of us. Perhaps you're facing your own battles. Maybe the road ahead feels too long, too lonely, or too hard. But Jeanne's life reminds us, even the smallest voice can echo through history. Even the humblest beginning can lead to a destiny no one imagined. So as you learn English through these stories, remember, it's not just language you're gaining. You're learning strength. You're learning resilience. You're discovering that inside you, too, is a leader, a dreamer, a soul that cannot be silenced. If Jeanne's story inspired you, share it. Let others hear her voice. Tell a friend. Leave a comment. Help this flame grow. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and join our journey here at WSE True Stories, where English learning becomes an unforgettable adventure. Until next time, keep learning, keep believing, keep your fire alive. Goodbye for now, and never forget the girl who changed the world with nothing but her faith and her sword.